problems with these measures. The facts presented in this section are sobering, yet they are typically taken with a grain of salt by policymakers. This casual attitude reflects in part the short-run focus of policymakers most interested in winning the next election, as discussed in more detail in Chapter 9. This casualness also reflects the fairly tenuous nature of all these computations, which depend critically on a wide variety of assumptions about future growth rates in costs and incomes, as well as assumptions about the interest rate used to discount future taxes and spending. For example, these fiscal imbalance calculations assume an interest rate of 3.6% if the interest rate is raised to only 3.9%, an increase of less than 10%, and certainly within the forecast error for this variable, the fiscal imbalance falls from 84 trillion to about $80 trillion. There is no reason, however, to think that these estimates are biased one way or another, either always too low or always too high. If the interest rate were to fall by less than 10% to 3.3%, for example, then the fiscal imbalance would rise to more than $1.5 trillion. Thus, while the assumption of an interest rate of 3.6% is a sensible central guess, there is a wide range of uncertainty around it. Sidebar cartoon. These projected figures are a figment of our imagination. We hope you like them. Back to the text. Moreover, not only do these calculations require potentially heroic assumptions about interest rates, costs, and incomes in the very distant future, they also assume that government policy remains unchanged. Even relatively small changes in government policy, such as a small cut in Social Security benefits, could have large implications for these estimates. This is not necessarily a problem with these measures, as long as the observer is clear that the measures are based on today's set of policies. Another problem with these long-run imbalance measures is that they only consider the pattern over time of transfer programs and not other investments in government policies. Suppose that the government borrowed $1 billion today and invested it in cleaning up the environment. This would look like an increase in the fiscal imbalance of the federal government, eventually requiring higher taxes on future generations to meet the government's intertemporal budget constraint. But this conclusion would not take into account that future generations not only pay the tax bill, but also benefit from the improved environment. So a true generational or long-run fiscal accounting should include not only future taxes and transfers, but also the benefits to future generations of investments made today. What does the U.S. government do? While not adopting these types of very long measures, the U.S. government has moved to consider somewhat longer run measures of policy. Impacts. See figure 4-3. There's a projected surplus and deficit, actual surplus and deficit. Text of the figure, projected versus actual surplus, deficit. Congressional Budget Office projections of the budget surplus and deficit 5 years ahead of deviated significantly from the actual surplus deficit, particularly during the high deficit years of the early 1990s and the high surplus years of the late 1990s and early 21st century. Back to the text. Until the mid 1900s, the budgetary impacts of most policies were considered over a 1 or 5 year window. This approach was viewed as having the important limitation of promoting policies that had their greatest costs outside of that window. For example, a policy that cut taxes starting in 6 years was viewed as having no budgetary cost, but the implicit obligation implied by this policy change could be quite large. In 1996, the government moved to evaluating most policy options over a 10-year window to try to avoid these types of problems. In principle, this should help promote policies that are more fiscally balanced over the long run. In practice, however, moving to a 10-year window added a new problem. It worsened the forecast error inherent in projecting the implications of government programs. The further the time frame moves from the present, the more difficult it is for the Congressional Budget Office to forecast the government's budget position. This approach leaves policymakers dealing with very uncertain numbers when assessing the 10-year impact of a tax or spending policy. This problem is illustrated in Figure 4-3, which shows the evolution of actual and projected budget deficits over the 1986 through 2005 period. The solid line in the figure shows the actual budget deficits or surpluses in each year. The dashed line shows what the deficits and surpluses for those years had been projected to be 5 years earlier. In July 1981, for example, the Congressional Budget Office projected that in 1986, the federal government would have a $48 billion surplus. Instead, by 1986, there was a $211 billion deficit. The Congressional Budget Office's 1983 predictions for 1988 were much closer and only understating the deficit by $50 billion. The errors then got very large, reaching a peak with the 1987 projections that the government would have a balanced budget in 1992, when in reality it ended up almost $300 billion in deficit. These errors are not one-sided, however. Beginning in 1992, the Congressional Budget Office began to dramatically overstate the deficit, so that, as shown in Figure 4-3, the Congressional Budget Office was projecting a larger deficit for 1997 than was actually achieved by the government. By 1995, the 5-year prediction for 2000 was for a deficit of more than $311 billion. In reality, the government ran a surplus of $236 billion by the year 2000, for an error of $547 billion. The problems that such forecast errors can cause became apparent in 2001. By the time President George W. Bush was inaugurated in January 2001, the Congressional Budget Office was using a 10-year projection window. At that time, the Congressional Budget Office projected a surplus that would amount to almost $6 trillion over the next 10 years. It said at that point the concern was that the government might pay down its debt and be left with so much money it would need to start purchasing private assets with its budget surpluses. As Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan said in his January 25, 2011 testimony before the Senate Budget Committee, the continuing unified budget surpluses currently projected imply a major accumulation of private assets by the federal government. It would be exceptionally difficult to insulate the government's investment decisions from political pressures. Thus, over time, having the federal government hold significant amounts of private assets would risk suboptimal performance by our capital markets, diminishing economic efficiency and lower overall standards of living than would be achieved otherwise. These projections led both candidates Al Gore and George Bush to propose major tax cuts during the 2000 presidential campaign, and President Bush delivered on this promise with a major tax bill in June 2001. This bill had an estimated 10-year cost of $1.35 trillion, although the likely cost is much higher, as discussed in the policy application that follows. Nevertheless, this seemed a small share of the nearly $6 trillion in future surpluses to deliver back to the American taxpayer. The problem, as we now know, is that the $6 trillion surplus never appeared. The combination of the 2001 and subsequent tax cuts, a recession, and the economic shocks of September 11th, 2001, terrorist attacks that had a sharply negative effect on the budget picture. By 2002, the government was already back in deficit. As noted earlier, the federal budget deficit is now projected to increase to $1.8 trillion and to remain large throughout the coming decade. This discussion should not be taken as a condemnation of the Congressional Budget Office, which does an excellent job of projecting government revenues and outlays given the available information. Rather, the problem is that forecasting 5 or 10 years into the future is a highly uncertain exercise. While moving to the 10-year budget window may have helped reduce trickery and designed to push tax cuts outside of the budget window, it also introduced more forecast error into the process. This reduction in forecast accuracy may have been a price worth paying if the move to a 10-year window had imposed more long-term fiscal discipline on the federal government. Unfortunately, this does not appear to be the case, as the following policy application discusses.